Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Shelby White. I'm chairman of the American Friends of the Israel Antiquities Authority, the preeminent organization in the field of Israeli and biblical archaeology, responsible for all matters of archaeology in Israel, which includes over 30,000 archaeological sites. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our 10th annual lecture series, Archaeological Discoveries in Israel. This lecture series is made possible by a generous grant from the Helen Diller Family Foundation. The image on the screen is a rendering of the new National Campus for the Archaeology of Israel, currently under construction by the Israel Antiquity Authority. It will be on Museum Hill in Jerusalem. This 300,000 square foot campus, designed by the renowned architect Moshe Safdie, will make accessible to the public nearly 2 million excavated objects, including 15,000 Dead Sea Scroll fragments. It will serve as the National Center for Research, Conservation, Curation, Publication, Education, and Illumination of all archaeological material excavated in Israel. We expect this to be ready in 2014 and 15. And if you'd like to know more, visit our website, archaeology.org. We invite you, in the meantime, to visit the ancient Near Eastern art galleries on the mezzanine floor to see our long-term loan exhibition of Chalcolithic objects, another project of the IAA in collaboration with the Metropolitan Museum. For today's lecture, Ashkelon, Seaport of the Philistines, we are fortunate to have with us Professor Lawrence Steger. Professor Steger is the Dorot Professor of the Archaeology of Israel in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at Harvard University and director of the Semitic Museum, also at Harvard. He is also president of the White Levy Publications Program, and yes, there is a connection. For 25 seasons, Professor Steger has also directed the Leon Levy expedition to Ashkelon, the oldest and largest Israeli seaport. Professor Steger has been visionary as an archaeologist, expanding the horizons of his discipline from political and historical in order to introduce social and cultural aspects of ancient society. Although Professor Steger will speak to us today of the mysterious Philistines, not as bad as we've been told in later centuries, who occupied Ashkelon for nearly 600 years, the site of Ashkelon is actually a timeline of archaeological history that stretches from the Canaanites to the Crusaders. In 1990, the site yielded the Golden Calf, probably one of the most celebrated finds from the Canaanite world of the second millennium. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lawrence Steger.
Thank you so much, Shelby White, and that kind introduction. Of course, Shelby White and the late Leon Levy were also visionaries in settling on a very important site that could be excavated not just for a few years, but for one generation, and is now going into its second generation of excavators. And because of their great support throughout this project, we've been able not only to accomplish a great deal in the field, and I hope that all of you coming in from the sunshine this afternoon will be at least slightly enlightened or see a little light at the end of this cave when we look at some of the great finds from Ashkelon over the years. With that project, we've been able to not only have a great team assembled on the site so that they could work as kind of their laboratory for field methods and so forth, but also many of them studied and received their PhDs from Harvard. I'm very happy that they've been with us for so many years, many of them. Many have gone out to other excavations and spread the word and the techniques that we first pioneered at Ashkelon. So the dig is sponsored by Harvard, as Ms. White suggested, and it is also co-sponsored by Wheaton College in Illinois. My co-director is Daniel Master from there, and also by Boston College in Boston. Appropriate, even though there is a Phoenix University that doesn't seem to be in Phoenix. Anyway, thought I'd clarify that. We also want to thank very much our two masters that we have at the site for monuments and all of the excavated materials and so forth. There is the Institute of Archaeological, the Israeli Archaeological Authority, of which we have Jacob Fish representing them today. And also we have another master, the Parks Authority that oversees this area where the site is located, which is the Yadin National Park. And under the grass and the tables and so forth are the various parts of Ashkelon that were there, generally for a period of about 5,000 years, running from the Chalcolithic period, around 5,000, all the way up through the Islamic Crusader era. And in the process of that, we have unearthed a portion of the site, but even with 25 seasons there, 26 now, it's still a very small portion of this extremely large site, over 150 acres, that sits right on the sea. We'll see more of that in just a moment. Here is an aerial view of the site. You can see that it's kind of an arc of hillock around it, and inside that bowl are more than 25 settlements, stacked one on top of the other, now reduced, many of them, to no more than 2 or 3 feet high. And the great mayor of Jerusalem came down one season. We looked up at a great section of those 20 or so settlements and saw how they were all reduced to rubble, many of them much older than the United States is young. And he remarked that, you know, the wise man who said, "And this too shall pass away," probably was speaking for all time this kind of wisdom. So we find that in Ashkelon, and it's been a tedious but very successful, I would say, excavation in trying to reveal some of these ancient cities. The one that I'll focus on today is the period when the Philistines occupied this seaport of Ashkelon, from a little after 1200 BCE down to 604 BCE, when it was totally destroyed by the armies of King Nebuchadnezzar. So for a 600-year period, about 3 times as long as we have existed, the Philistines occupied this site in Ashkelon. And we'll look at the history of that, at least the beginnings and the endings of that important civilization. About all we have left today of that civilization is the name Palestine, that still was applied by the Romans and others to large stretches of earth there long after the Philistines had disappeared from history and archaeology. And of course, still lingering with us is this rather misconception of a Philistine as some kind of bumpkin, uncivilized character who does nothing but make oafish statements, engages in debauchery, guzzles beer, and the like. So they've received a very bad press, starting with the Hebrew Bible, right on through Milton and others up to this very day. So I hope I can speak a few kind words about the Philistines and that we can maybe correct some of these misconceptions that have developed over the ages. You can see this arc now. The arc itself is about 2.2 kilometers, and within that arc, which forms a kind of theater. If you imagine that as the seating arrangement, there are 3 tells inside the arc, And then the stage would be right there on the seafront. As you can see, it runs for almost a kilometer up and down the sea. We've worked on the northern site. I'm not going to speak about that today. Most important things there were the great ramparts and city gates. We have the world's oldest arched gateway that's ever been found, that is to date anyway, dating back to about 1800 BCE. We know that the shape of the site took form at about that time when the Canaanites, who also later invaded went into Egypt, took over Egypt, let's say, and are known as the Hyksos in history. But within this arc is about 150 acres. Some of the site has obviously eroded off into the sea on the west, but we don't think more than about 10 or 20 meters have disappeared there. As we look at this arc that surrounds the bowl, or the theater, it turns out that it's built on the dunescape that was there, sand dunes that were ever present, and over that were built mud brick gates and ramparts, and around the whole city were moats, some of them quite deep, 15, 20 feet deep and 20 or so feet wide, to protect against siege armies coming towards the site. But it worked mainly as a great seaport. And we have to recognize that these so-called city-states of the second millennium and into the first were not just agrarian settlements. Some of them, especially on the coast, were really commercial kingdoms, and much as a caravan city would be in the desert, so some of these commercial centers, seaports on the sea, had to make their living and survival through commerce and trade rather than by just subsisting on the land and the peoples that occupied the lands. In fact, when you go to the east of Ashkelon, you'll find very few sites in the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. The Iron Age is the main period we'll talk about today. Just a few sites, not enough to support a population that we would estimate is about 12 to 15,000 people within those ramparts. So there's no way that you could have supported more than a tenth of the population that was in Ashkelon at that time on just the land that was out to the east and around it. What they did have were very productive sandy areas for growing the vine. And of course, wine became a very important product, commodity that in all periods they were exporting to places like Egypt, which couldn't grow the grape very effectively. And so they enjoyed the wines of the southern Levant and north into Lebanon and Cilicia as well. As we move farther east, we have cities that are connected with the Philistines. About 5 major cities are mentioned in the Bible, and these are known as the Philistine Pentapolis. They include Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gat. 4 of those cities have been or are being excavated today. The only one that isn't, of course, is Gaza, which is under the modern city. Ashkelon itself is about a 30-minute ride south of Tel Aviv, a much closer ride, if you could get there, to Gaza, about 15 minutes by car, but we don't go there today. There's records of the sea peoples that Ramses III, the pharaoh of Egypt, records on his temple walls in wall reliefs in Egypt at Medinet Habu. And among them are these reliefs that show a battle that he claims to have fought around 1175 BCE. And of course, the Egyptians, at least if they record it, never lost the battle, even though we have some doubts about it when we look at other evidence that might provide different results. The sea peoples, including the Philistines that are represented on those reliefs, are in these little feathered helmets that you see to the right in the bird-headed prow and stern ship. The Egyptians have their own headgear and weaponry, and they're in the lion boat behind. At this time, a new development happens in sailing. They develop what is called the brailed sail, which allows them to lower different parts of the sail as they wish, and can actually tack into the wind, not be just forced by the wind in a special direction. So that was a very important development around 1200 or thereafter. This is a close-up of what they incised in their walls at Medinet Habu of sea peoples and a Philistine there. They're called Pelesit in the Egyptian inscriptions. We don't know how it was vocalized, but the same consonants of Pelishtim as we have in the Bible, namely Philistines. And there were other groups with them that supposedly attacked different parts of the coastal area and also almost made it into the delta of Egypt, but were thwarted by Ramses III. Now, one of his predecessors a little earlier was a pharaoh named Menephta. He was a son of the great pharaoh Ramses II, and here is a sculpture of him, and on the left is a stela recording his fight or wars with the Libyans. But there's one very special hymn in this stela that records his battle with the Israelites when he claims to have practically exterminated them. He claims to have defeated Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yanoam. Actually, he also made reliefs on the wall, Menephta did, and fortunately put an inscription beside one of them, indicating the one in the lower register there has an inscription showing and telling about the defeat and humbling of Ashkelon before the Pharaoh. And you can see them inside the citadel there begging and beseeching the deity and the Pharaoh for mercy. If you'll note, they have long hair or a skull cap. They have long robes, long beards, long hair. This is important because we'll notice that there's quite an abrupt change after 1200 when we look at the inhabitants of Ashkelon and other places in Philistia. They are no longer hirsute. They have, they're especially these feathered headdresses that we saw from the Medinet Habu reliefs. And there's evidence, I think, that we have a new people that have migrated or invaded even parts of the southern Levant and carved out an area right in the heart of southern Canaan that had been controlled by the Egyptians. This is important to remember because they actually did make great inroads there. And early Philistia, the earliest Philistine 5 cities, occupied an area that's about the size, now not the population of, but about the size of Los Angeles, which would give them an area of about 500 square miles that they controlled. Later, they expanded their territory into areas farther east, farther north, and ultimately came in great conflict with a group coming down from the north, the highlands there in green, the early Israelites. And the period when this was most acute was when Samuel was the prophet and Saul was the first king of the kingdom of Israel, followed by David, who actually drove back the Philistines after having actually served with them as a mercenary for a while with his group. And you can see the earliest Philistines are in the darker red. That's where they first settled with the 5 cities. And then they expanded into the orange area, and eventually they met, after almost 150 years, the Israelites coming down from the hills, and they were trying to go up and claim territory there. So that led to problems. We have some representation, not very good representation, but of ships that were painted by Philistines on pottery from Ashkelon. Here's a little sherd of one of them. On a crater, we have a shipping scene, a marine scene, in which a rather dyspeptic dolphin seems to be confronting a warrior with a kind of punk hairdo or one of these feathered headdresses with his shield and his spear at the ready. It seems as though this ship sank, and on the other side of the crater, we get another Philistine. These, by the way, are how Philistines painted themselves in the period of about 1140, 1130 BCE on this crater. He's in, it looks like a unicycle, but actually it's a truncated chariot that he's in, and he has the typical eye, pupil, and of a Mycenaean painting, and these feathered headdresses or headgear, and behind him is the water bird that accompanies so much of their iconography. They also had chariots. Because they were in the plains, you can operate chariots very successfully there. They don't work so well up in the hills, where the Israelites were located in these earlier periods. And we actually found a linchpin to the right in the shape of a goddess, we think, one of the enthroned goddesses, but here represented by her head on the top of a linchpin that fits through the axle and holds the wheel of the chariot on the chariot. And another interesting piece that we found just nearby was this ivory knob that sits on a part of the harness over the withers of the chariot horses. Believe me, that was a bit of a mysterious piece for quite a while until I visited the Cairo Museum and saw Tutankhamun's chariot and outfit, and there on top of it all was this special knob. In the Canaanite period, now we're going to look at the sequence that happens in Ashkelon to indicate that this group coming as Philistines were really a new people and not, as some have suggested, just local people, Canaanites, copying other people's ways, life ways, and characteristics. As you may know, in the last few years, migrations and population movements haven't been so popular among archaeologists, partly because this idea of migration was somewhat abused earlier on with some rather fantastic claims being made, such as Phoenicians making it to Brazil, or Bar Kokhba coins laid there in the Jewish period in Tennessee, and runes and other things that have been part of this fantastic archaeology, as I like to call it. But I think migration and long-distance movements are making a comeback, and should be, because there's plenty of evidence now for it if you use the evidence wisely. Well, this is a typical large Canaanite house, has a central court, and then rooms around it. It's called, the Germans called it a Mittelsaal house, and we have one of those in Ashkelon before the Philistines arrive and before we see the Egyptian presence there. At this time, they were importing Mycenaean goods, Cypriot goods, coming from probably via Cyprus by ship to Canaan. When we move into the next phase there, above the Mittelsaal house, we find a very large wall which we have dubbed the Egyptian Garrison wall. It's of mud bricks, and it's built according to the Egyptian royal cubit. The size of the bricks, the width of the wall, all of those things follow pretty much the tenets of making a mud brick foundation and wall in Egypt. It also had buttresses, and we only have a part of the wall in this area that we've excavated for many years, but above it, of course, were some 20 settlements before that, or I should say after that we had to excavate before we got to the Egyptian garrison wall. There are whole examples, though, complete examples of these garrisons that were planted in Canaan by the Egyptians sometime between, remember the defeat that Menephta claims to have made of Ashkelon. He might have actually built this wall, but it seems more likely it was developed slightly later under the time of, or just before the Philistines arrived, in the time of Ramses III, about 1175 or so. In addition, we have also Egyptian pottery, real Egyptian pottery and Egyptianizing pottery. Some of it made of local clay, but in the Egyptian style. What they have on the left there, they call beer bottles. Obviously, they're not for drinking beer, or they're more like flower pots, but they may have been part of the whole processing manner of making beer. Egyptians were very much a beer-oriented culture, as were the Mesopotamians in many periods, whereas the Levantines, contrary to the misguided descriptions of the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Israelites, and the Philistines seem to prefer wine. In fact, these famous Philistine beer jug is probably not a beer jug, it's a strainer jug, and it's a strainer jug for wine, not for beer. Anyway, there's an interlude of these Egyptians at Ashkelon before the Philistines arrive. This is how much of the Egyptian-style pottery we find. In addition to the garrison wall, we have silos for grain to support the troops that are there from the Egyptian garrison. And there's a well-known ivory from Megiddo that mentions the prince of Ashkelon and a certain singer named Curator, or however you vocalize the Egyptian, we are not certain. But anyway, he is mentioned in these ivories. Now, one thing that happens very dramatically at Ashkelon, when you get above the, as you're digging in the period just after the Egyptian garrison, when it goes out of use, we find a whole new town or layout in this part of the Tel, which represents the earliest Philistine presence we have at the site. And it's probably to be dated about 1170 BCE. And the buildings are quite substantial. There's probably a monumental building back here. Unfortunately, the edge of the North Tel there just goes off over into the parking lot, and so much of that is gone. But we found a huge column base in that building and a plaster floor. Then this was all subdivided in the next Philistine stage, and a very fine building here to the lower right that has several rooms connected with it, and we'll see more of that later on. We're still in the process of digging that. We should complete it this season and determine whether or not it actually is just a house shrine. It's a very fine house, if that, or a Philistine temple, the first independent building used as a temple, if it is that. Here's the whole layout at about 1170 to 1160 BCE. And it's totally different from what the Egyptians had there, totally different from what the Canaanites had there. So if you're going to make the case that these are just simply the local peoples that are being influenced by the Cypriot merchants and changing their lifeways and aren't really any new groups migrating there, I think you have to deal with this very substantial evidence that suggests something very dramatic is happening there. A whole new culture is being planted. I would say it's actually almost an urban imposition. They're coming into this area, they know what they want to build already, and they lay it out, first stages of their settlement. This is not some shabby little squatter coming in by sea or by land, building a tent, building a shack, and eventually evolving into something quite substantial. It's already there from the very beginning, and the Egyptian garrison wall is now submerged under these buildings just here. We also have the first really good evidence for dating this appearance of the Philistines at Ashkelon. And it comes from a large piece of pottery, an amphora, with the cartouche of Ramses III on it. He reigned from about 1181 to 1150. And somewhere during that reign is when the Philistines arrived, made their attempt to actually go into Egypt, but stopped short and carved out this great real estate that became Philistia in the heart of what had been Egyptian country. In fact, they disconnected one of the main overland routes from Egypt up into Phoenicia and farther north, the so-called Via Maris, the way of the sea, or the way of the Philistines, it became known as in the Bible. Earlier, it was known in the Egyptian lore as the ways of Horus, the great hawk god of Egypt. And also we had another scarab that was embedded in the floor of the first Philistine settlement there of Ramses III. And we now have carbon-14 dates too that I won't bother you with, but they are supporting very much the other evidence that we have through Egyptian connections. Now, one of our very important scholars working on our earlier pottery is Penelope Mountjoy. And she has looked at this Mycenaean 3C pottery, especially the locally made in different parts of Cyprus, Israel, and Cilicia, and all over the eastern Mediterranean, and concluded that we fit, and I won't trouble you with all these nomenclature, but Mycenaean 3C early 2, that's where we fit, which is dated by her to about 1170 to 1160. The next phase takes us into the middle phase of that and puts us on the about the 1150 side of that century. Now, they didn't discontinue totally the use of Canaanite cooking pots, but they also made their own out of the local, well, I shouldn't say all of it out of the local clays, because some of these cooking pots, or jugs as we should call them, were imported, and these are the typical Aegean types of cooking pots. The cooking style was changing. They had smudges in places that the late bronze Canaanite cooking pots didn't have. You can see them here on the side. Those smudges of carbon come not from a direct contact with the embers of a fire pit or a hearth, but are leaning up against the ashes and would be in a cooler state of food preparation. Well, these make up quite a high percentage of the repertoire, maybe as high as 85% of the cooking utensils that the early Philistines would have had. In addition, they no longer use shell, which was local, or straw, as the Egyptians did in their pottery and the Canaanites in theirs. So there were major changes. Also, I should have just added, you can see how narrow the mouths are of these. They find these also in Crete, and with it they had marks on dogs that they were actually making part of the diet, and they were pot-sizing the bones. That is, they were cutting them up so they would fit into these jugs, and we have something similar happening at Ashkelon, but we'll see that a bit later. When we look at the style of housing and how they entered, especially their domestic architecture, this is a typical Israelite Canaanite house. 2 pillars, 2 rows of pillars. You enter through here. There's a middle room, side room, sometimes with stables or troughs in between the columns, and storage in the back room. And these would have another story. The lower story was for food processing generally, and the upper story was for sleeping, eating, and the like. We have a totally different system working in the domestic architecture at Ashkelon, where we have quite a fine sequence of it from about 1150 till 1175 down to about 1025. And you'll see that it is a linear pattern. You go in one door and then through another, either a side room from which you move, or you move linearly into the house one way, and you can only go through one door at a time. And it leads into more complex structures, as you see here. It's somewhat under the overall, but probably wrong rubric of a Megaron-style house, which is also linear, but our domestic architecture follows pretty much that linear pattern, and that has been analyzed by one of our important supervisors and part of our staff, Adam Aja, who did his dissertation on this domestic architecture. And the best prototypes of this architecture are in the Peloponnese, Mycenae, and the area of Corinth. We also have in the earlier periods a number of scarabs, and they decrease as we go through the periods of the Philistines. A lot of these early ones are actually residual. That is, they've popped up from the Egyptian stratum on which the Philistine one is built, and many of them are much earlier heirloom scarabs. So just the sheer number is not an indication of what was there when the Philistines were working and building the site. What was there were these Ramses III scarabs embedded in the floors. Then they decrease as we go through time, and they're probably all at that level residual or coming up from earlier occupations. This is that building that I mentioned to you had some of the best architecture from the very beginning into the second phase, and maybe a house shrine or a temple. Here we're seeing it from the top. And some of the artifacts that are emerging from that, and you can see in this position, is a wonderful raised hearth. Raised hearth with pottery on the top of it. This is not known in Canaanite culture or the Egyptian culture, at least in Canaan. It is known throughout the Aegean, and it is another one of those new ways of heating and cooking that came with the new cooking pots into this area. The hearth is often by a single pillar that is found holding up the ceiling of the room. In another room around this building, or in this building, I should say, next to the central room, the hearth room, which may, if it's actually a temple, will have been used for the fire sacrifice. We'll talk about another altar pretty soon. Over in this room, we found a bowl with more than 5,000 beads connected with it, necklaces that had broken, and quite a job to collect those almost minuscule beads, but fortunately we have. And other things found in the building. Here are some other artifacts. And this is an interesting one, a basket. And all we have are the ghosts of the basket. These are called phytoliths that are left when a rope disintegrates, or something that is a plaster floor disintegrates, or grasses or things are becoming fossilized. And with careful digging, you can actually see the pattern of the basketry and the spiral there. Another interesting piece, the only one found in Israel to date, is this Hydrea, a very important piece of pottery that is known from the Aegean. But then the main feature of this building, at least for us, was this engaged feature that sat right in next to the wall, embedded into the wall, and it was quite mysterious when we first came down upon it. The first thing that you would see would be just a little circle here of plaster. And fortunately, they didn't scrape the plaster down, or we would not have had the horns of this plastered altar. It's a very fragile thing, but it's built around a mud core, or mud brick core. We don't know for sure whether it's bricks or just rammed earth. And then these 4 projections were built onto it. This got the nickname of an inverse Hathor udder, but we decided it probably was not that. It did not have burning, though, on it. We were convinced it was some kind of altar, but when we did our research with the Weizmann Institute, there had been no fires that had been on this, but so probably it was a libation altar. So you would have had in this room the libation altar, and if the other was an altar, or the hearth was used in an altar in the other room, that would have been the fire altar. This is unique. We've seen 4-horned altars in early Israel and up in Syria, but they're quite different. In the Aegean world and the Cretan world, we have horns of consecration, but usually we think of those as being only 2 horns, and here we have 4. So it is, all we can say now, a very unusual item in the early Philistine repertoire. Here you see our reconstruction pretty much of the building, the different rooms, the altar, the horned altar, rooms going off this direction, and then we're now excavating this whole portion, and probably will see if this reconstruction here is accurate when we reach those levels this season. This is one of the buildings that we hope to preserve for the tour of the site that Shelby White indicated in her introduction. So this is the layout of Ashkelon, at least in one area where we have the earliest Philistines. It seems quite clear that they had imposed a whole new plan or scheme on the site, as they did at Ekron, about 25 kilometers away to the east. This is the Tel of Ekron, excavated by Trudy Dotan and Cy Gittin and others, and it increased from a small late Bronze Age site, which was burnt down, to a site 10 times that size of the early Philistines, same period as our Philistines. So it looks as though there was a major migration, probably by sea mostly, coming into Philistia around 1170 BCE. Those who want to ascribe it to elite emulation, this is the bogus notion that has been applied too many times to areas that it should not be applied to, in an attempt to explain culture change without admitting migrations or other forms of culture change. I simply think that it cannot have happened just by the local people meeting Cypriot merchants, because by this time in the 12th century, everything has changed in terms of the networking of trade. You remember when we had the court-style house, imports were coming via Cyprus from Mycenae and from Cyprus into Canaan. Those stopped in Philistia after 1200, after 1175. And we're not talking, though, about a dark age, as many have tried to say about the world of Greece or East Greece. In fact, it's not a dark age. Trade still is going on, but trade is following a very different network. It is now no longer via Cyprus coming to places like Philistia. It's more north-south, going up the coast to Phoenicia, to Cilicia, and parts farther north and down into Egypt. Another interesting part of the early civilization there that is quite different from anything that comes before are these textile weights, spool weights. And you can see they're in a row here. We were the first to actually identify these properly. They're rather homely looking things, spools of unbaked clay, and the typical weight before was a pendant that you would put on the warp of a vertical loom, and they're pierced, or they could be even horseshoe-shaped or donut-shaped. But these are not pierced for the most part, and they're slightly pinched at the waist, and we find hundreds of them in the early Philistine houses. It's a domestic textile business, and these are the spool weights or the loom weights around which they would wrap the thread and use them as their weights. They're known in the Aegean, they're known in Mycenae, they're known in certain sites in Cyprus. They were not known in Canaan beforehand, and the earliest examples come from Lefkandi in Greece. And we're fortunate that we have a later bowl from Cyprus that actually shows these spool weights being used as warp-weighted weights, and many strands are connected with them, and you can see the beautiful textiles that they were producing in this particular case using those spool weights. These have been used now, experimented with by weavers, and they're found to actually function quite beautifully as weights. So we're quite confident that that was their use in antiquity during the Philistine period. Other things that they brought with them that weren't there before were bathtubs. And we find dogs with cut marks that we don't find among the Canaanites or Israelites. And the cut marks are very similar to those that you would find on a sheep or a goat, so there's every reason, I guess, to believe that they actually cooked some of them, but they're not very frequent, so maybe on only a few occasions did they decide to boil or cook their mature dogs. We do have, though, some foundation deposits of puppies that are in cooking pots that we find inside the houses. Several of those. Puppy in a pot, it was known as. Another favorite, a new invitation to dine, came with the arrival of pigs in great numbers on the dinner table there in the Philistine houses. This was not a very popular item among the Canaanites, the Egyptians, and of course the Israelites. When you dig those sites, you'll find very small percentage of pig. When we get to Philistia, in yellow, you can see what happens with pig. In the Canaanite periods at Ashkelon, very small numbers, a little more at Ekron. When we get to Philistine Ashkelon, they go up to 20 and 30%, as well as at Ekron. When we go to the Aegean, you can see how pig becomes quite a part of the fare. It seems to me that perhaps some of the taboos that the Israelites enjoined against the pig was a way of saying, you know, look at those awful Philistines. They eat pig. We don't. And it may have been part of the origins of that taboo very early on in the Iron Age. And another thing that we've discovered that now is starting to appear at other Philistine sites, but not in the number that we have, are these jar handles, amphora handles, that have special signs or notations on them. We find them already in the late Bronze Age, and they all come from Cyprus when they're shipping goods in amphoras and so forth from Cyprus. These signs are replicated in the Cypro-Minoan script, and it's known especially from Cyprus and from Crete. The language still is undeciphered, but it is found in several examples there, and we've noticed it coming up on handles in the early Philistine period, and now we have quite a repertoire, almost 50 of these amphora handles with these signs on them. They're all made after firing, and you can see where they're coming from. In the late Bronze Age, Cyprus, through petrography we know that. Then we find a lot of them from Phoenicia, some from Dor, and some locally made in Ashkelon. So this is probably the signs that hide the earliest Philistine language, which we are not, of course, able to decipher yet, but this is a start in the repertoire of signs that will give us clues to the early Philistine language. In Cyprus, it led to the early Greek, Cypro-syllabic. They used the Cypro-Minoan signs, and that developed out of that. I would guess, but it's just a guess, that we will find that once it's deciphered, it will be some form of early Greek that we're dealing with in this Aegean culture, Mycenaean culture, that settled into the southern part of Canaan. In this room, we found an ostracon, 9 signs on it. You read probably from right to left. And these are the notations, the numbers that are given to those signs in the Cypro-Minoan catalog. And it was our great epigrapher, Frank Moore Cross, who first recognized these as Cypro-Minoan script. There's also a clay tablet found in Afek, up near Tel Aviv, in the Ekron River, which actually also has Cypro-Minoan signs on it. It was found in the Philistine stratum there, and it comes petrographically, its signature of the clay tablet is Philistia. We can't say that it's Ashkelon for sure, but it's in that area. Well, the Egyptians tried to surround what was left of their land in southern Canaan with these forts, and we'll see that it led to a kind of cordon sanitaire that they built around Philistia. They couldn't actually take Philistia back, and so they built forts like this. So across from Ashdod, we have an Egyptian fort at Tel Mor, and this is Ashdod became Philistines. The pottery from there, locally made. Ekron was Philistine. But outside, you had a site like Gezer, and we always wondered, we thought maybe Gezer was Philistine, but it turns out it doesn't have enough Philistine material to suggest indigenous Philistines. They just traded some of the Philistine material into the site of Gezer. And we had this circumcised phallus that was found in the 60s there, and this was a great quandary because if the site was Philistine, which it wasn't, why was this ceramic phallus circumcised? Well, now we know they were outside the range of the uncircumcised Philistines. The green areas where the Philistines were outside the red area was not. This is another kind of fort that was built down here opposite Haror, which was Philistine. This was Egyptian. And you can go right around through Gaza and find Tel Farah South, these fortresses. And it was once thought that these sarcophagi were Philistine, but they're not. They're actually Egyptian and represent that ring around Philistia. This is Lachish. We find them at Deir el-Balak by the dozens. This is the sarcophagus that was used to bury Egyptians who died in Canaan serving the Pharaoh in that period. Now, in a few moments, I will take you to the end of the Philistine period. We looked at the beginning. It's quite clear that a new people have settled in. They have all of these characteristics of the Greeks, and it contrasts very vividly with the surrounding Israelites, Canaanites, and Egyptian cultures. Probably one of the reasons that it is so pronounced, and I should say this is the greatest case study for determining ethnicity through archaeology that we have anywhere in the Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean. When we talk about sea peoples and we see where they're supposedly landed at other parts farther north, it's not, the expression that we have of them is not so vivid and so great in so many categories as we find in Philistia proper. And one of the ideas that my co-director Dan Master came up with, that with this cordon sanitaire, closing off the Egyptian surroundings, trying to hem them into Philistia, was that it only pronounced the vividness, the attempt to retain their Aegeanness in this Philistine territory, much more than you find in other areas where they might have been more diffuse in their acculturation. Anyway, the last days of Ashkelon were quite well documented, especially in the annals of King Nebuchadnezzar, who says that he turned Ashkelon into a Tel forever. In 604 BCE, this would be in our calendar, and he didn't exactly make it a Tel forever, because later we find Phoenicians there, we find Persians, Greeks, and all the way up through the Islamic Crusader period. But there is a 75-year gap that follows the scorched earth policies of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, the destruction came in 604, and the prophet Jeremiah warns about this and gives a warning to the people of Judah, saying, look, don't mess with Nebuchadnezzar. He didn't say it in quite those inelegant terms, but in his prophecies he said, don't go to that weak reed Egypt. Egypt will betray you, will fall apart, and you will be swept under the ashes that will be left by Nebuchadnezzar. And he did this also, he did the Philistines as a kind of example 18 years before Jerusalem was to fall for almost the same reason. The Judahites were playing too close to, for comfort to the Egyptians, and the Neo-Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar just simply said, you know, if that happens, wipe them out. Well, there's a winery that belonged to the last king of Ashkelon, Philistine king Aga. He had two sons that we hear about. They were exiled to Babylon, and we read about them there receiving rations from the king much later in 592 BCE. There was also the most important thing that we've discovered in the 7th century, the seaside bazaar, the marketplace. Now, another one of these dogmas that has cropped up in Near Eastern, but even more so in classical archaeology and interpretation, follows the economist Karl Polanyi, who said that markets did not exist in antiquity. And if that's so, I wish Professor Polanyi were still around, because I'd like to have taken him to the bazaar in Ashkelon and see how he would have described that or explained that in the late 7th century there, because I think we have excavated the first archaeological example of a marketplace that is in action next to the sea. We'll see that in a moment. Here's the winery, a whole series of rooms with presses and so forth on the left, a street running through it, storerooms on the right. Here's one of those presses and my sketch of a few Philistines treading out the grapes. Here's an aerial view of that marketplace. It was only in existence for a short time. from about 625 to 604 when it was destroyed. But it was a very lively place, and we've got a kind of snapshot. I mean, the sadness for the Philistines, their great regrets, the destruction and all, was our great blessing, in the sense that it was as though an earthquake or something had hit the area and given us a still life of what was there on the eve of their destruction. And it was a very, very viable and cosmopolitan center and seaport. There were shops along the upper region there, a series of shops. One had dispensing wine and dipper juglets. Another had cuts of meat that were there of sheep, goat, and cattle. They seemed to throw the heads of the sheep out into the street, but they probably had hanging cuts of meat there of mutton and beef for sale. And as you move around through the street, there were storerooms here, a kind of administrative building over in this corner, and then this was a very important area, the counting house, where they would actually make payment for some of these things that they were buying and selling in the marketplace. The marketplace was known in the Bible, it's called chutzot, and it actually literally means streets, but a lot of sales went on in the streets, and when in the earlier periods, when David is giving his elegy for the death of Saul and Jonathan, who fell at the hands of the Philistines, he says, publish it not in Gat, tell it not in Gat, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, better yet, the marketplace of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice. So there were probably markets there much earlier, going back to the time of of David and this earlier Philistine period there. When we look at what's being imported into our marketplace in the late 7th century, we have these amphoras that were big basket-handled amphoras coming from either Cyprus or Cilicia. We can't tell petrographically which area could have been either. Also, cooking pots that were coming from this area of Cilicia and other kinds of vessels. This was a bowl for grinding condiments. It's called mortarium because of mortars and pestles. And they liked that because it had special kinds of mica in it that allowed the grains and things to be, spices, to be ground more effectively. So those were coming into Ashkelon, into the port. When we move down the coast, we come to Phoenicia, and a lot of Phoenician amphoras carrying various commodities, mostly wine, some oils, and even other things could be in there. We also have evidence from Dor, other vessels that are coming from Phoenicia at this time. Some trade with Egypt, but probably what is mostly coming up from Egypt is Nubian gold and another thing that's found in the delta, natron, which was used for mummification among the Egyptians and among Phoenicians at this time. We don't know what the Philistines were doing with it for their adult burials because we don't have Philistine cemeteries yet. It's still a mystery where they buried their adults. The children they buried under very young children, infants, under the floors of their houses, but that doesn't help us with the adults. Here's some Egyptian faience and pottery jars, the god Bes in faience, amulets, alabasters, and these wonderful situli or bronze bottles that have been studied and published in our big volume, Ashkelon 3. If you want to really know about this period, you'll have to get our 830-page book, Ashkelon 3, which is just out. And we're very happy to say that it won a prestigious book award, the Levi Sala Award that Ben-Gurion gave out just a month ago. And it was considered by a panel of archaeologists, good archaeologists, I say that because we won the book prize, as the best final report among those that have been published, and there have been dozens and dozens of them during the past 3 years on the archaeology of Israel. So we were very pleased about that. On the right is the winery. You can see in the circled area Egyptian objects, also in the marketplace Egyptian objects. These probably indicate that there was some Egyptian oversight during this period in Ashkelon, but not that they were controlling the trade and all of that. Here's a repertoire of vessels of that period. Wine was coming in similar jars from Ekron, farther inland. Olive oil was coming from there. That was the olive oil area. And of course, Egypt did not grow the olive very successfully, and so they imported olive oil throughout their history, as they did mostly wines from up and down the coast. As we look at the marketplace again, you'll notice the wine amphoras and dipper juglets. Then we'll see, this is Professor Cross reading or deciphering one of the inscriptions on a bowl to Leon Levy, who's standing in our tent just outside the excavations. That particular bowl said Ugim, cookies. We're not sure who the cookies were for, but probably some offering bowl with these cookies. Directly interesting to what's going on in the marketplace is this inscription in Neo-Philistine about a commodity, a cereal that is being sold there for silver. And just next to it, we found part of a balance beam for a scale with a weight pan and different weights. It had been used for weighing out silver up to the value of whatever the commodity or product was bringing or selling for. And in that same area where you see these two red circles were piles of grain. We know what grain was being sold. It was wheat. And in the one pile, there were weeds that are known only from farther inland in Judah. So we know that the wheat was imported overland for the inhabitants of Ashkelon and sold in the marketplace there. The other one had weeds and things that were only known from the fields up in by Tel Aviv in the Sharon Plain. So that was being imported by sea. So in those two red areas, we had piles of grain coming in to sustain the population there, because it only lived really mostly by trade, not by what it could grow in the vicinity or the hinterland, where there wasn't much in the way of population or arable land. They did, though, have good wine, as I said, and vineyards to sell those abroad. Other interesting things, chamomile and things like that, were coming in from the desert, the Negev area, Beersheba and the like. And now we can see some of the trade routes. Things were coming from the east, from the south, east, from the north by sea, and a lot of this was on its way to Egypt and other parts of the Mediterranean. As a seaport, then, not only at the end of their life as the Philistine community, but early on, all of these commodities were being bought and sold and were part of the lifeways and lifeblood of this great coastal seaport. Oh yes, the grass peas. These, if you have a shortage of wheat, the Aegean peoples would tend to make bread out of Lathyrus sativa, a grass pea. Don't eat too much of it, though, because if it becomes more than a third of your bread intake, you get sore feet, and you can only walk on the balls of your feet. And there's a great disease called lathyrus, or lathyrus, that is caused by that particular food problem. We have altars also in the counting house. Here's an incense altar that was found on the roof. You remember Jeremiah inveighs against rooftop altars that the Israelites and the Judahites were offering incense to the Queen of Heaven on. Well, here's one of those incense altars on a rooftop near the counting house. Some of the debris from the destruction, it was a vast destruction. Everywhere we went, we found things that were being destroyed. Beautiful things from East Greece, the Ionia and the Greek islands, cups that were part of the tableware. From Chios, the island of Chios, we have this Sphinx. And as you can see, even though we have the biggest collection of Aegean pottery, it's only 1% of the total repertoire at Ashkelon. So at the end of things there, Nebuchadnezzar comes in. He not only doesn't stop at the gates and say, surrender, he knocks down the gates, he goes in and ransacks the whole town, burning it to the ground. He has a scorched earth policy wherever he goes, and this group was getting too close to his arch enemy, Egypt, and so he destroyed it, made it a tell, and the Philistines disappear from archaeology and history from that day till now, and we only have left the name of the Roman area, Palestine. We have then this misconception of them as these bumpkins, uncivilized oafs who actually ran a very vital seaport, cosmopolitan seaport, trading in all parts of the eastern Mediterranean. And I thank you for your attention today.